And welcome back to Football Weather. Galen, Clavio, Matt Blaszka joining you once again as it is the end of the regular season, Matt. We've got conference championship games coming up, and then, of course, Army-Navy still to go, but the regular season is all but over as we just finished up rivalry week and got a huge side dish of coaching search drama to go right along with it. It was a dizzying day if you were following along with the college football headlines. We're going to get to all of that in the show. We'll talk about the conference championship games that we've got on tap this upcoming weekend. But first, of course, we'll recap what happened over the course of this last rivalry week. Matt, how you doing? Good to see you.
I'm doing well. It was certainly a great weekend of football, right? We didn't have a lot of upsets, but certainly some great discussion, some great games, certainly into later yesterday. And then I'm just really happy Marty Smith gets to go home.
I know. We were all worried about Marty. There's such a thing as hazard pay when it comes to college football reporting, and getting locked in the complex, I guess, for Ole Miss while you're waiting around is not the way I would have chosen to spend the holiday weekend. But I'm glad that we were able to get him out of there. It is funny, though, because, we end up with him interviewing Lane Kiffin at the airport, and I don't know if anybody's seen the picture. It's like someone described it as like a dictator getting deposed, and like somebody doing an interview with him before he flies off into exile. It's very bizarre. There's like a chain link fence behind him, and
fire,
desolate landscape in the background. I mean, it was fitting for the way all that went down, but my God, what a weird circumstance down in Oxford and Baton Rouge and everywhere else. So. It certainly put a capper on what was maybe not an incredible weekend of football. There were certainly some interesting games, not a lot of truly interesting results. There were a couple. So we'll talk about those here in just a second. But first of all, just a quick reminder, we are brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and a stunning array of college football apparel that they continue to roll out for a whole bunch of different teams across the country. Your team is represented. The team you're curious about but don't want to fully commit to is probably there as well. They had a huge Black Friday sale, which you just missed, which we talked about last week, but that code got you 30% off everything. You can still get 15% off your first order at Homefield Apparel by using the code HOME23. Again, HOME23. Head over there, go to the website, and you'll be amazed at the variety of especially football weather gear, not the show. That's an aspirational thing down the line. But certainly the huge array of stuff you can wear in actual football weather. Although, as we head into conference championship week, in most cases, we're kind of leaving football weather behind in favor of warmer climates and climate-controlled stadiums. But, again, Homefield Apparel, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network and Football Weather. All right, Matt, let's go ahead and dive right into things. We debated what to start with. We're going to start with the games that occurred. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. We'll keep this a little bit abbreviated because we've got so much else to talk about. But there were some top-line games that happened, and probably the most impactful of them occurred even before the weekend fully got started, going back to Friday as Texas knocks off Texas A&M in Austin 27-17. A&M had an early lead, could not hang on to it. Not a good game from Marcel Reed. Really good game from Texas in that second half as they kind of got things going. Arch Manning had a couple of good moments, and it moves Texas at least back in the conversation in some people's minds for the playoff, and certainly as far as A&M's concerned, knocks them off of the undefeated perch. They're still fine, but it is kind of an interesting thing now because as much as people tried to brush that South Carolina game off as evidence of their ability to come back, maybe it was a cautionary tale instead.
Yep, I think that's exactly what I tweeted. That should have been a cautionary tale for what this has looked like. And they never looked comfortable in this game. Even though they led at halftime and led midway through the third quarter, it just never felt like they were maybe the better team, and Marcel Reed threw those two picks. Arch Manning is getting a lot of praise. I mean, he was fine. He obviously he made the big plays, and it got them to the 27-17 final, scored the win by 10 against A&M. And obviously you have the coach going on at the end saying this is a playoff team and everything else that's going on. Certainly they're going to make their argument that if they don't play Ohio State, they're probably in the playoff, but it certainly now puts them in the mix, and we'll dive more into that as we get going on here. It is curious now with a 9-3 team, a 6-2 in the conference. They have some big wins. They have one of the uglier losses on their resume. It's going to be. I'm really curious where where the committee puts them here next week or in 2 days, I guess. But it's interesting to see how this is all shaping together. As now we finally have our first real 9-3 test case, and how that's going to look with the committee. But the problem for them is everybody keeps winning.
Yeah, that's the absolute issue. And I mean, I've got some resume things I'm going to bring up with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I expect Steve Sarkisian, like any coach, to advocate for his team. I get that. Mm-hmm. What I hate is when those advocations or whatever, when we just take with unquestioning, stenography, I guess, what these coaches say without fact checking a little bit afterwards, like, well, here's the argument against. And it seems like all weekend, all we've gotten is coach after coach saying, we belong. Clark Lee did it with Vanderbilt, Steve Sarkisian. Of course, they're going to say that, but let's have some actual reporting on numbers and facts with this stuff. I think it would be helpful. Anyway, moving on, Georgia 16, Georgia Tech 9. You texted me during this game because I was driving, something to the effect of Georgia is playing with its food again. And it's just, again, it's one of these situations where Georgia was the superior team and they've gotten the benefit of the doubt of kind of just doing enough for the victories. But I kind of wonder if maybe this isn't just enough. Instead, it's just what they are, which is not that impressive of a team despite their gaudy numbers in the power ratings. It's
interesting because I did text you that, and they couldn't move the ball against a Tech team that has been giving up yard after yard the last two games. They're down 20-0 to Pitt the week before. It was really curious to watch them play. I don't know what was going on, certainly, but this has been the standard all year. Sometimes the defense looks great, offense looks terrible. Offense looks great. There's never been really any consistency outside that Texas game a couple weeks ago, and the Vanderbilt game, Mississippi State the game before. We haven't really seen a full month of Georgia football that we're like, okay, this is the Georgia, and I'm not expecting them to be the Georgia 21-22, but I'm looking at Stockton's, Gunnar Stockton's number, 11 for 21. I watched a lot of this game. It was unimpressive. He did not look great. 70 yards. It's interesting. Obviously, they're going to play Bama here this week, and they're going to get another crack at Bama, and certainly that would improve their positioning, and we're, looking at them as probably a 2 or 4 or 5 seed, but I have my reservations, and this has been what we've talked about all year. The SEC has been the same. There's no great team. There's a lot of teams that are very good, and all those teams can be beaten on any given Saturday, whatever they're going to be playing these playoff games. So, got the win. They're 11-1, knocked out Tech, but certainly going forward, there's a little more pause for the Bulldogs.
Ohio State 27, Michigan 9. Ohio State finally gets that monkey off their back and does so in very impressive fashion. Michigan looked entirely outclassed for the vast majority of this game. And give Ohio State credit, one of two teams to finish the season with an undefeated record. And they looked very dominant, very physical. And there was nothing that surprised me in this game. It started off slow for Ohio State, but I felt all along Michigan probably didn't have the horses to compete this year, and that was certainly the case.
Yeah, Michigan scored. They went down, got the first 3 points. Sane throws the pick, and we were watching the game together, and we're like, they could score a touchdown. It's 10-0. Doubt creeps in, but they settled for the field goal, and that was it because they only scored 3 points after that. Ohio State looked really, really good, the same they played all year. Suffocate their opponent, make them try to throw the ball when they really can't. And Michigan has no passing game. Underwood finished with 63 yards. I mean, it was just, and that drive, Ohio State had that 11-minute drive. It's just, and they was just an impressive to say, we're going to beat you this way to end this game. And they did. And the Buckeyes looked really impressive. Now, obviously we'll have another game this week, but it was a really impressive win to watch that unfold and get that monkey off their back for the Buckeyes.
Yeah. And look, I'll give them a lot of credit. We questioned the quality of their opponents throughout the course of the Big Ten season. They really played a weaker schedule even than Indiana or Oregon. And yet in this game against a Michigan team that, was 9-2, was certainly in playoff contention. If they'd beaten Ohio State, they just handled them throughout. So very impressive by Ohio State. And as you mentioned, they'll face Indiana, who was also impressive, albeit against a much weaker team, knocking off Purdue 56-3. There wasn't much to say in this one other than this was just a complete domination. And Indiana also finishing the season off 12-0. First for them in program history, and sets up a really good Big Ten championship game, which we will talk about a little later on. The other Big Ten game of note, Oregon goes into Husky Stadium, knocks off Washington 26-14. This game was never out of competition, but it also felt like Oregon had control relatively early on. And even though Washington did score a little late to make it a little bit interesting, Oregon pushed the lead back out to double digits, and that was that. This Oregon team still injured, still needs some time off. They're going to get it now because they don't have to play in the Big Ten championship game. Probably destined for somewhere between a 5 seed and a 7 seed, which will be a nice start for them. And that's a dangerous team. That's a team with a lot of good weapons on it.
I think you hit the nail on the head. They're starting to peak right now, and they haven't had their best 2 receivers really for about a month now, a month and a half. This is a tough place to win too, and so I mean, Washington made it 19-14, and then Oregon went right down and scored to make it to make the 26-14 the final score here. I was really impressed with watching their defense really dominate that game. Washington's been good. I mean, I know they've had some tough ones. They've lost to Ohio State, lost to Oregon. Obviously, the Wisconsin loss isn't great, but they've been really frisky all year. This is a good win, and as you said, they're going to get the time off they probably need. And I mean, you mentioned a 5 seed. There's probably an outside shot for a 4 that gives them even more time off, but that's a possibility, but it's certainly out there.
Yeah, it's we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's an interesting scenario, and one that was made even more interesting by one of the polls that came out today.
Yep.
A team that does not look good and continues to not look good, but continues to win. Oklahoma 17, LSU 13. This game demonstrated everything wrong with Oklahoma. And they were really fortunate to be playing an LSU team that I don't know if they didn't have an offensive game plan for this game or what the deal was, but they just looked completely inept, as we've gotten used to seeing. And yet, even with all of that, Oklahoma had to have a late touchdown on a complete busted coverage in order to pull off the victory here. They're 10-2. They're not going into the SEC title game, so they're definitely going to be in the playoff unless something really weird happens with the committee. But of all the teams going into the playoff, this is maybe the team that's got the most questions and should feel the least good about themselves at this point.
Yeah, I mean, their defense has been really good the last 3 weeks, starting with Bama, and then obviously LSU's not a good offense, and Missouri just had privilege to come back here last week. But that's what they're holding on to, that their defense can carry them the entire way. I just don't know how they can win multiple games in the playoffs. Maybe they can get one if they're at home. Maybe that helps. But I feel like we've watched this same game for 3 straight weeks against Bama, Missouri, and LSU. And look, hey, they earned it. They won they had to win all 3 games. They won all 3 games. That's all you got to do to get to 10-2. But you're right. I don't know the path for them getting out, but certainly we'll discuss that later. But they look like they're a playoff team.
Yeah. The other game in the SEC of note was a fascinating one for similar reasons, really. Alabama 27, Auburn 20, the Iron Bowl. Again, Auburn just looked like it had a non-functional offense for the first half. They get it going in the second half. They really put some pressure on Alabama. Crimson Tide end up on a 4th and 2 in the red zone, going for it and scoring a touchdown that gives them a 7-point lead, and then Auburn fumbles it away. Much closer than I think you would expect for an Alabama team that's now in the SEC title game. This does not appear to be the same Alabama that we're used to seeing, a better version than last year, perhaps. But again, I think an SEC team that goes into the playoffs and the SEC championship game with some question marks around them.
That 4th down felt like peak DeBoer from like the Washington teams from a couple of years back, just always doing that. It worked out. And I even said, what are they doing? Let's just get the field goal, win the game. And they went for it. They ended up scoring a touchdown, win the game. Anyway, it's the same song and dance as Georgia, right? You kept hoping that, Alabama was up 17-0 in this game. You're like, okay, Iron Bowls are usually close. This might be not that year. And then, Auburn got it going and they tied the game up. But yeah, it's the same as Georgia. We're waiting for that Bama team to really kind of come out and just dominate. And we haven't seen it. We haven't really seen it at all this year. So again, SEC, really good teams, no great team.
Yeah. And actually, the team that played the best this week in the SEC, arguably Vanderbilt, 45-24 winners at Tennessee. In the non-playoff era, this would have been a win that I think they would have celebrated like a national championship. They're on the outside looking into the playoff right now, and that's unfortunate for Vanderbilt because it was a great season. But what a big win! It's just, this is a series that kind of feels like it's flipped a little bit now in terms of where the power is in the relationship, and Vanderbilt with just a great capper on a season for them. And for Tennessee, they end up finishing the year really having beaten nobody. And while 8-4, they actually fall out of the AP poll finally this week. They were replaced by Mizzou, so don't worry, SEC fans. But I think a lot of head scratching and a lot of soul searching in Knoxville. Whereas with Vanderbilt, I mean, they're going to be right on the doorstep of the playoff, and I just don't see them getting in. It could happen, but I don't see it happening.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. They're just going to be the odd man out. Their two losses really are going to back them out. They lost to Oklahoma and Texas, right? So I expect Texas to probably jump them, even with the 3 losses, to be ahead of them next week. They're just boxed out based on who they lost to, and it's unfortunate. Great year, their first ever 10-win season. They joined Indiana, had their first 12-win season. Ole Miss had their first 11-win season. So a lot of firsts in this year for some teams that aren't usually on the perennial powers. But it's interesting as Clark Lee also signs extension this week, flips a 5-star. It'll be interesting to see where Vanderbilt goes from here and if they can build off the success of this particular season.
Indiana and Vanderbilt both are programs that have traditionally just not put resources or much care into football. And that's almost been a conscious choice. And the thing is, both of these universities have a ton of money. Vanderbilt doesn't have a huge alumni base, but they are the richest school in the conference. And Indiana, of course, has the big alumni base. So you might be seeing 2 programs that are just here to stay at this point. And that would be really cool, I think, for both conferences and for college football as a whole. Big 12, Texas Tech takes care of business in Morgantown, 49-0. No question on this one at all. And it sets up a meeting with BYU in the Big 12 title game as they won 41-21. Bad start for them against UCF. They were down 14-0 and then outscored them 41-7 over the last 3 quarters of play. So we get the rematch, and I think for both of these teams, closing the season strong, and they both had to because they were playing some inferior competition. Both of them needed really big margins here, I think, to keep pace in the eyes of the committee.
Yeah, Texas Tech is 4. They end up being 4. I didn't see the last poll. They were 4. So they're in a really good spot to potentially get a bye. I mean, really not much to say about the game. 49-0. We're going to talk about. And BYU struggled to start, but again, like you said, they ended up pulling away anyway. Now BYU is the only 1-loss team not in the playoff currently, and certainly they're going to have to win this game to get themselves in. So for them, this is a great season. Lost their quarterback in July to go 11-1 with this team is just a fantastic story that I think not a lot of people are talking about, but it's a really interesting that they have a chance to go to the playoffs.
Yeah. Finally, in the ACC, Miami takes care of business on the road. They knock off Pitt 38-7. We had some questions about the weather. The cold in this game didn't affect Miami at all. Really good game out of Carson Beck, 23 out of 29 for 3 touchdowns. Miami's done at this point all they can do because the results did not fall their way. They're not going to play in the ACC title game. 12th in the AP poll, and just still sitting on the outside looking in, waiting for this next committee ranking. This was an important win for them in terms of comparison purposes. We'll see if it was enough, but they certainly did about everything they could have done in this game, including win the game by a bigger margin than Notre Dame beat Pitt by recently.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like that was their goal, to win by more. And now they have the comparison point. We'll talk about this at the end of the shows, but maybe some thoughts on how Miami could possibly do this. It's all about Miami getting closer to Notre Dame. I think that's their only path forward.
Elsewhere in the ACC, the reason Miami's not going to the ACC title game, first of all, Virginia takes care of business in that rivalry game against Virginia Tech, 27-7. And then SMU, all they needed to do was win, and they were going, and they run into the Calgorithm. The Golden Bears knocked them off. Wild finish to this game.
That was great.
I mean, SMU comes back from a huge deficit. I think they were down 31-14. They score multiple touchdowns, take a 35-31 lead. Then Cal drives down the field, scores a touchdown to take the lead. And then SMU got the ball back again, drove down the field and missed a field goal at the end that would have sent it into overtime. Really fun way to close out the day. But it ends up landing Duke, of all teams, in the ACC title game. And that's got some interesting implications. But congrats to Cal on finishing things off. And congrats to Virginia, 10-win season. I don't think anybody saw this coming at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, Virginia was were one of the last teams in the millennium. This did not win 10 games. There's only one team left. Sorry, Purdue, that has not won 10 games in the 2000 or later. But yeah, I mean, this is Virginia's best season in a long time. Happy for them to get a chance to play for a spot in the playoff. We'll be playing Charlotte next week. We called this Duke thing 2 weeks ago. Everyone was sleeping on it. I'm like, there's actually a realistic path. Like, Cal has played really well at home all year long. They took Virginia late. They had it was Miami maybe earlier on too. They've played tough all year. And so, like, it wasn't a surprise that they won this game, but SMU was never in it really until the fourth quarter. They had to really come back. So, unfortunate ending for SMU is they struggled early in the season, and then they really kind of seemed to put together at the end. But we now have a Virginia-Duke game, which if I'm an ACC fan, okay, we'll talk about this here in the story in a little bit. What happens if Duke wins?
Yeah, there's a lot of question marks. It's going to be interesting to see what occurs there, which we'll get to when we talk about that matchup and some of the implications for the CFP. Last game of note, Notre Dame 49, Stanford 20. Not the huge margin we thought we might get out of this, and part of that was because Jeremiah Love gets injured in this game, goes out with a rib injury, not sure of the severity of it, but he only ended up rushing for like 50 or 60 yards in this game. And Notre Dame, this was a game that was going to ding their strength of schedule because of how bad Stanford is. They certainly took care of business in this game, but this wasn't going to help their playoff cause at all. All it could have done was hurt it. I don't think it did that either.
No, I mean, 29, they're up 35-3 at halftime. I turned it off. I think it was 21-0. I was like, do I stay up? I'm good. Yeah, but I mean, Love did go down early. I think he only played one possession, actually, and then he was out. But Notre Dame's going to have 3 weeks off here as well. We'll assume they make the playoff. They're going to have 3 weeks off before they play another game. So hopefully it's not a big injury. But now Notre Dame's put themselves in a spot where they had to win all 10 games. They won them all by double digits or more. They put themselves in a spot to potentially make the playoff.
Yeah. Let's I think that's all the games. I was going to go through some of the G5s. We'll wait on that because all that really matters is who's going to end up playing in these G5 conference finals. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we've obviously left one game out, which was the Egg Bowl, which was the first game we saw on Friday. Yeah. Ole Miss does a workmanlike job. They knock off Mississippi State. It was kind of a weird game just because of the atmosphere around it. But Ole Miss took care of business. And then, of course, the Lane Kiffin soap opera went into overdrive. We thought we were going to get news on Saturday. Then we didn't get news on Saturday. Then on this morning, we thought we were going to get news. And then we finally kind of got some news as we found that apparently Kiffin not only had agreed to the LSU job, but was planning on bringing coaches with him and things like that. That finally concludes as Ole Miss ends up naming their defensive coordinator the permanent head coach, not interim, but permanent. And Charlie Weiss Jr. ends up joining Lane Kiffin on the plane to Baton Rouge. Ole Miss ends up, it looks like, keeping most of the staff intact. Obviously, no offensive coordinator and no former head coach Lane Kiffin. But it doesn't appear like they've lost any personnel, at least not that we know of as of yet. I haven't seen anything pop up. This concludes one of the weirder sagas that we've seen in terms of a coaching change. Matt, you watched all of this transpire. I mean, what has been – how do you conclude your thoughts with how all of this has gone down? We talked about this scenario 2 months ago.
Yeah.
2.5 months. It was really at the end of September we started talking about this. The idea that a sitting coach might leave a playoff contender to go to another team. I don't know anybody that necessarily thought it would be this particular situation. I guess maybe we should have just assumed, given that Lane Kiffin was involved.
Right.
But it's happened, and you've got a team that's going to be in the playoff who's going to have a brand new coach on the sideline when that first playoff game happens. What are your thoughts on all of this?
I think so if we just back it up just to look at Lane here, everyone is entitled to take any job they want. right? But the way that this played out over the last 10 days, where they had a meeting last week, and then the meeting was supposed to be after the game yesterday, and then Ole Miss was in the mix, I think, all day yesterday, which I'm assuming also played a role in this, of this thing getting delayed as far as it did until Alabama finally won that game. It seems to me that from a Ole Miss perspective, the able to name a head coach was probably their thought in saying, if we name this guy, he's well liked by the players. He's actually a really good recruiter from everything I've been reading. And he was able to keep a lot of the staff, not the offensive staff, which I think is really interesting, that this was their way to keep this intact to go make a playoff run and not be maybe dinged by the committee, which I think is a really important factor. And we can talk about that, I think, here too, is when I was looking through Ole Miss, I think we both agreed they would probably fall somewhere in the 6 to 8 range without any of this stuff happening. I don't think they'll get dinged now because they certainly seem to steady the ship here. I am curious how this goes forward. If all the players stay, if there's no other exiles. Certainly, Kiffin thought he had probably more guys going with him. And it didn't work out that way. And so kudos to the AD for making sure that he kept it together, right? Today, announcing the new head coach. You know, I saw some people talk about, it's not always the best situation to name the head coach right away. And I used the example of Marcus Freeman 4 years ago. Go the LSU coach, Brian Kelly, going there. And I know nothing about Golden, zero. I couldn't tell you one thing about him. But if this is the right hire, then great. And maybe it works out and maybe it doesn't. But it's the one way to steady the ship with the current players there. We saw it, like I said, work with Marcus Freeman. And I think that's the only move they can make because if you make him interim, does that have more staff flee? Or are people like, hey, he's the head coach, we'll buy into what this coach is doing. We can keep the recruiting class together. We can go win this football game, win multiple football games in the playoff. They're 11-1. This was probably their only path forward to actually keep this together is where my thoughts have ranged all day after seeing. How many times have you and I texted today? 50 times about different things. I mean, just going back because there was no decision. We didn't get a decision from Lane until about 4 o'clock today that he was actually leaving, and then he throws the AD under the bus, and the AD responds, "Lane's not coaching. He's not the head coach here anymore. We're moving on, and we're going forward with our new head coach."
Yeah, it's. I mean, the whole thing has just been strange to watch from outside for a variety of reasons. You know, I think. My feeling on this is that Kiffin, I don't know that LSU makes the move that they did, firing Brian Kelly when they did, if they didn't already know that Lane Kiffin specifically was interested in this job. Because the thing is, I mean, LSU's got a ton of resources. It's a really desirable job. They clearly have a lot of money that is available specifically for football and the head football coach. And I guess I'm on their side surprised that this is how they've decided to go about it, that they threw the kitchen sink essentially at this particular guy as the head coach in waiting. They had to have known he was interested when the process got started. And if that's correct, I think Kiffin really thought I've thought about this a lot this evening. I really think he believed he was going to be able to maneuver this so that he was going to be able to coach through the playoff and then just leave whenever he wanted to afterwards. And I give Ole Miss a lot of credit for not allowing him to do that, because I think there's a ton of reasons why that's a terrible idea. And a lot of it really comes back to this idea that you have got to understand, like, what you're doing is setting up not your rival per se. I don't know that LSU is necessarily a rival in the traditional sense of Ole Miss. They're normally in different income brackets, so to speak. But you can't just allow Kiffin to sit there, operate from a position of power within your program, and then leave, because I think we saw what he was planning on doing, which was bringing the staff with him, bringing the players with him. And that's where it's like the balance has to be, if you're Ole Miss, yes, we want to have success in the playoff. We do not want to denude our program tree of roster talent and have to start over in coaching at the end of the cycle, simply because we're letting this guy do what he wants to do. And, you know, the idea that they, and all of this nonsense on ESPN especially, about how this was unfair to Kiffin, that Kiffin should be allowed to coach the team as long as he wanted to. Kirk Herbstreit said something to that effect on game day. It's like, it's just not how the way the business works. And this is business. This is not a sentimental, emotional decision. Ole Miss, I thought, given the hand they were dealt, played the cards about as well as they could have played them. And the fact that they found someone on staff that they felt comfortable enough with, that they hired and made the permanent head coach, we don't know if that's going to work out. It rarely does. It worked with Marcus Freeman. That is absolutely the exception to the rule. It worked with Kyle Whittingham when Urban Meyer left Utah to go to Florida. But again, exception to the rule. But when you're trying to balance both, we have a playoff caliber team that's going to be in the playoff, and we have to have some kind of a succession plan in place where we're not going to automatically get our roster stripped and have to start all over again. I thought that Ole Miss handled about as well as they could. And I think for Kiffin, this is what you wanted at the end of the day. You wanted to go to LSU. Well, guess what? Now you're at LSU, and this is going to hang over him for the rest of his career. It probably won't matter much in the big scheme of things in terms of how people perceive him, because I think people already perceived him, despite all the image rehabilitation attempts over the last month. All that looks planted now, does it not? Like,
it's definitely planted. Yeah,
all of it looks just so like.
He's holding the program hostage all day. It's like, come on, dude.
Right.
You know,
all of it looks so manufactured to lead up to this moment, where it's like, how do I make myself look as good as possible while leaving for a job that I feel is going to provide me more resources and more ability to win? And this is where I come back to LSU, and this is my last comment on this. It's wild that all of this happens, and you've now gone out and hired a guy who is, at least for the moment, a pariah, who's, his best season thus far has been 11-2 and a Peach Bowl victory. That's the best season he's had in the entire 11 years he's been a head coach at the college level. That's a big roll of the dice for a coach that is, or he's 50, he's still relatively young, but you've just come off Brian Kelly, a guy you hired with the idea that he was leaving a program that could get to a championship game but not win it, but this was going to let him get over the hump and let LSU get over the hump. They've just done it again, and I don't know that it's necessarily set up that it's automatically going to be better than the Brian Kelly era went. The whole thing just feels bizarre to me, and it's like everybody backed themselves into the wrong corners on this, and now we're left with what is going to be a fascinating soap opera, but may not necessarily result in championship football.
I do wonder, for Lane's purpose at least, when Kelly got fired, well, I know it was only officially last week, but 6 weeks ago, if he thought, we'll probably go 9-3 and I'm not going to have to worry about this. And then as things continue to roll, he probably figured out, how do I get out of this without looking like an idiot? And he just kept rolling the ball down the hill, right? They had a meeting like last week. They were supposed to do all these things, and there was no way out. You're right. There was no way they were going to coach. And let's be clear. The G5 coaches that have left, like Golish and Summerall, and that Summerall will have the opportunity to coach in the college football playoff, is a completely different situation than the Ole Miss coach or the LSU coach coaching LSU or the Ole Miss players in the playoffs. There's no route forward with that. I'm sorry. There's just not. Yeah. It's completely different.
Unless your name is Kurt Signetti, you're not bringing a roster of talent that can make it to the playoff from your G5 school. Like, that's just not happening.
It's not happening. Yeah. And so let's put those guys aside here. From an Ole Miss perspective, and you mentioned there's an exception, this is the exception to the rule, is Marcus Freeman. And certainly it's almost the same exact scenario. Notre Dame was fifth in the playoff, and they could have still made it when Kelly left. They obviously didn't make it that year. But they had the same internal. What do we do if we do? Do we want to have this entire coaching staff? Are they all going to go with Kelly? Are we going to build with Marcus Freeman, pay him everything? And like we said, it's worked out. Same thing here. If I'm an Ole Miss fan, this is our best season ever. We have a chance to, and I'm not saying they're going to win the national championship, but they have a chance. We've said on this pod, outside of Indiana, Ohio State, there's been no dominant team at all in the SEC. Ole Miss has won their games. Have they played the hardest schedule? No. But they have an opportunity to win playoff games. And who says they can't win the national championship?
Right. Yeah.
Crazier things have happened. So just go for it And if it doesn't work out and you win the national championship with this coach, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't, because you did it, right? Yeah. So like I think Ole Miss played this as best as they could. We'll see what happens. If we're going to transition here to the playoff, I don't now see them. Well, even though they lost a lot of the offensive coaches, I don't know if they'll be dropped far enough to not be in the playoff. Maybe they don't get a home game now. I think they're going to be firmly in.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about it more when we get to the play. I have a couple questions from Twitter that I wanted to take, but I have a hard time seeing them punishing Ole Miss at all, given the way that this ended up playing out. I think there was a real danger that it was going to play out differently, and it didn't. So I think the committee was desperately hoping that they weren't going to have to make that kind of a decision, and I think they got excused from that based upon how everything played out. So we did have some questions that I wanted to get to. Sam asked, so we've heard a lot on, the game day for a couple weeks in a row. Saban's mentioned this, like the problem is the calendar. The calendars. Lane Kiffin's conduct wasn't the issue here; it was the calendar that was really to blame. But okay, let's. So the question from Sam was, given when university semesters are, is there any schedule change that could avoid this? And we had a similar question from Robbie. There have been many justified reasons or requests to change the format / schedule for different windows within the offseason, recruiting, coaching changes, etc. Can you offer suggestions on what a better structure would look like? And as he notes, that could be an entire show. It probably should be.
Yeah.
There's not really a great structural change unless you postpone all player movement until after the spring semester. But that would also involve like getting rid of early entrants in recruiting. And that's really where the big problem comes in. Because the trigger for all of this, when people talk about the calendar needs to change, I don't think they're being clear enough about what that means. The calendar piece that's the problem is National Signing Day, early signing day. It's not the final National Signing Day. It's just the early period, which is the one that happens over a 3-day period this upcoming week.
It's Wednesday. Starts Wednesday.
Yeah. So Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I think it is. And that you've got to have someone in place during that time period, because as we've seen, players, as much as fans don't want to hear this in many cases, players don't really sign in most cases for the school. They're signing for the coach that they're playing for, as would I. I think that's the intelligent thing to do if you're a college athlete, is who am I playing for? Who's going to develop me? But what that does is it makes it imperative for new schools hiring coaches that they get that coach in so that they can bring recruits over, which, LSU already had a lot of players in the hopper that were probably of a higher caliber in most cases than Ole Miss had. So I don't know if it's as big of a domino that to fall both directions here, but that's a hard one to change, because a lot of those players are not planning on going back to high school in the spring semester. They're planning on enrolling at the school that they've committed to in the spring semester so that they can do spring weight training and spring ball in general. Do you have a solution for how to fix that, Matt? That seems like a pretty immovable object right now.
I mean, unless you went back to this one sign day in February, but like you said, these coaches want these players in January. So that is an immovable object. So unless the coaches came there, that's not going to happen. The other ones, I guess the other one would be the championship games. You just eliminate them. So you gain a week in the schedule. So you have the playoffs start this week, and then 2 weeks later, you have the next week since the next round. You tell Army Navy, sorry, we're going to be playing the playoffs, and then you're done by January 7th or 8th. Schools are still starting, but it's less schools are in session. I think until you detach the calendar or detach the academic calendar to college football, there's no solution that's going to work. And I saw people talking about having coaches sign contracts. They have to be here for the end of the season. I mean, it's a free market. I don't know how you would do that in a contract that's going to make them stay. You can leave it really anytime. I know I think Saban mentioned this last week. The NFL has a rule where you can't go coach on their team if you're fired at the end of the year. It's a little different when we're still playing. We're trying to do everything at the same time. I know they moved the portal date to January, so that's, I think, helped a little bit. But when we're having free agency, National Signing Day, playoffs all in the same time, you're asking to unwind a lot of stuff, and it's just not going to happen until, like you said, they either have to figure out a better signing day, which I don't think is going to happen, or we just get rid of the academic calendar being part of college football.
I mean, there's multiple academic calendars. There's the semester system, which is, I think, what most schools use. You've got quarters, you've got trimesters. Quarters, Northwestern uses quarters. I think UCLA uses quarters.
Yeah.
There's some others out there.
I think.
Yeah. Oregon uses quarters. So you don't start till kind of the end of January in the spring. You don't start till the end of September in the fall. But you're still running up against the problem of the rest of it. I mean, part of the reason why they've moved the calendar around the way that they did, and they moved the transfer window start to the beginning of January, was they didn't want players transferring off of playoff teams. They're like, oh, well, that'll fix that. Well, no one thought about the coaches and how integral. Like this is part of the problem. Is a lot of the decision makers in this are not coaches. They want, and many of these places want to believe that players are coming for the school. And in reality, they're largely following the coaches. And again, I think there's nothing wrong with that. But what it means is if you've got coach movement, you're going to have player movement. And if you don't have anything that allows either coaches to move in a particular window, or you don't create some kind of a setup where there's a real disincentive to move, then you've got some real problems that I don't know are easily fixable. So I'm with you in that again, this is where, when those of us who talk about, this is why college athletes should probably be professionals and employees and sign contracts, and people get all like offended when you say that kind of thing. These are the things that happen when you don't have that, and when the only professionals in the room are the coaches. And as you said, if you're not going to restrain that level of movement at all, and again, I don't know that there's a good route to restraining it, you're going to have these kinds of situations. It feels like when they created this system, no one conceived of the idea that a head coach at a playoff bound team was going to jump for a better situation, because the assumption was all of the great teams or all the great programs were just going to be in the playoff every year. And what's fascinating is now, like, no, Ole Miss is not supposed to be in the playoff that was in the brains of the people that created the college football playoff. Indiana is not supposed to be in it. Texas Tech is not supposed to be in it. Who is supposed to be in it? Alabama, who wasn't in it last year. Texas, who's almost certainly not going to be in it this year. USC, who's not in it this year. Michigan. And this is, I think, the real problem, is that those jobs are going to, in many people's minds, be better jobs. Yeah. Sam's second aspect of his question was, why would someone who has a legit shot at winning a national championship want to have Jeff Landry picking their assistant coaches instead? Jeff Landry, the governor of Louisiana, who had quite a turn in front of the microphones a couple weeks ago. That's great. But it has the reason why is Kiffin really, I believes that it is a better opportunity for higher ceiling and more sustained success than he can do at Ole Miss. Because, again, I mean, he's had a good career at Ole Miss in terms of the overall wins, but 10-3, 8-5, 11-2, 10-3, 11-1. Like, that's the 5 full seasons that he's coached at Ole Miss. And in that time, second, tied for third, tied for second, tied for fourth, and then this year tied for first, but didn't go to the SEC championship game. So I think in the minds of him and in the minds of other coaches, like, hypothetically, let's say Ryan Day had beaten or lost to Michigan yesterday, and Ohio State freaks out and fires him this morning, and suddenly that job is open. And let's say their number one target that they decide is like the Texas Tech head coach, who's the coach of a team that's about to go to the playoff. They've got a game, and they're like, we're going to offer you X number of dollars. And he's like, of course I'm going to take that job. Well, that scenario is probably going to keep playing out, because that is the one thing that the top programs still have over the second tier programs that are now intruding on the playoff party, which is we can take the thing that got you there because we can pay them more and promise them more. I don't know that that's fixable unless there is some kind of a uniform code like there is in the NFL that Saban referred to, where all these schools decide to get into business and actually agree to a common set of rules. Until that happens, I don't know that there's a fix that any calendar change could alter, you know?
Right. No. And this sport historically has had people just move like this, right? They talked about when Tuberville left, right, to go from Ole Miss to Alabama. So this, or Ole Miss to Auburn. So this has happened before, and obviously it's changed a lot now. And I think Kiffin, and to Kiffin's credit, he's called this, more transactional business over the last 6-7 years since it's become this transfer portal is wide open because you have the opportunity to really fix it quickly, bring who you want. He's been the portal king since he's been at Ole Miss. And certainly that's going to change now because he's going to be in LSU's back here. You're not going to do that as much. I mean, you'll be able to still build a roster with it. But I think I'm curious if this is going. It's not going to be a 1-of-1, and the way Lane handled it's going to be a 1-of-1. But I'm not including the group of 5 because that's a completely different conversation. But in terms of, like you said, the Ohio State programs, there's 4 or 5 of these programs that change that paradigm. And you mentioned the Texas Tech head coach. There's other coaches that maybe just signed contracts. The Clark Lees of the world, maybe even Kurt Signetti was Ohio State's open. Why would I not take that interview, right? Like you're not going to take that look at that job. It does not make any sense not to do it. It's the best job in the sport. Like, and you're guaranteed, to have the most resources more than anybody else. So why not? LSU's in the same boat. So you make a great point, right? There are those programs, but I am curious if this is a blip or if we see more of these in coming years.
Yeah, I mean, I think until there's some kind of uniform collection of rules, you probably can't fix it because you're never going to be able to, nor should you necessarily want to divorce college football's calendar from the academic calendar. I do think there's some things that could be done. There's some flexibility that should be allowed in terms of what classes you're taking and when you're enrolling and how all of that works out. Like you and I both work in higher education. This is not an impossibility. No. A lot of times this is academics digging in their heels when they make exceptions in other areas all the time.
Right.
But I also think this is a control thing. And again, a lot of it is about controlling athlete movement. But what's so important in college football in particular is coach movement. And until you do something to control that, and I don't even know if you can, you're not really going to fix anything. So anyway, let's do a couple of playoff questions and then talk about the CFP stuff. So we did have a question from Jim. Why is the national media pushing Texas so hard? Seems very reminiscent of 9-3 Alabama last year. So this might be a good place to start talking about the teams we think are in, the teams we think are in trouble, and the teams that are kind of on the bubble. I'll answer Jim's question first, and I'd love to get your answer on it as well. Texas is the most engagement farmy damsel in distress in the SEC. Like people have got, you've heard of Texas. They were in the playoff last year. They have probably one of the 4 or 5 most recognizable players in the country in Arch Manning, even if he hasn't played particularly well this year. National brand, once had their own network that ESPN produced and propped up. They know that that's going to get attention. They know it's going to get discussion in a way that, complaining about Vanderbilt's plight will not. So that's really the reason why. And look, I mean, Texas has a couple of good things on their resume. And certainly, I think anybody that beats Texas A&M and hands them their first loss of the year, that deserves some note. But there's no real argument for Texas compared to the other teams that are on the bubble. And I just think it's a layup that they know that they can argue and get a lot of attention for. And that's really the full explanation for it all.
Well, and, they are 9-3. They have played one of their tougher SEC schedules of note. I guess that's what been the argument. They did just knock off a team that's undefeated. But people seem to forget what happened 13 days before that game. They got blown out by Georgia. Like, if you reverse those games, no one's having this conversation. And they also lost to 4-8 Florida. Yeah, watching that Florida State game, it's like, who is going to have the worst loss here? Alabama or Texas? Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But it does seem like they're trying to prop Texas up. They were 15 or 16 last week, and I was going back and forth just trying to figure out what scenario would get them in. So I sent this tweet out a couple of times yesterday. I don't know if you want me to read this, if this would just be just kind of a thought process here, but I have bye locks and then playoff locks and everything else. So I went by, and this is not including the ACC or the group of 5, just because that's 11 and 12. I don't think that's going to change at this point. Would you agree with that, Galen?
I mean, there's a couple of scenarios that we can't completely discount, but go ahead and we can talk about the exceptions here in a second.
All right. So I put bye locks, meaning they have a bye in the playoffs, or Indiana, Ohio State. I don't see either of them not getting a bye. I put bye control. There you go. Bye control, meaning they control their rest going to get a bye. UGA and Texas Tech went on Saturday. Playoff locks: A&M, UGA, Ole Miss, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas Tech, and Bama. So we have one spot then if all those in my mind are locks, which is between Notre Dame, BYU, Miami, and Texas. And then I put sorry, Vandy. I don't see a path. And then Utah, they have no wins and they can't get above BYU or Texas Tech. The reason, and I saw this question posted, I can't remember if it was to me or you, why I put Bama as a lock. And we discussed this yesterday while we watched the game. Bama has already beaten Georgia at Georgia, the only team to do that this year. And not that this matters, but no one's done that since 2019. You're telling me they're going to knock Alabama in a game that is a neutral site that they've already beaten this year. I don't foresee that happening when it shouldn't hurt them that they're playing this extra game and they've already beaten that team. Same goes for Texas Tech. I put this in my notes too. They've already beaten BYU. There's no way they're going to be knocked out. They may be knocked down. But the weird thing with Bama is they are right at the cusp. And I just don't know how they get knocked down. I would venture to guess that Notre Dame would get bumped if that scenario were to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with I think Alabama now is safe regardless. I think if they lost the Iron Bowl, there would have been a more open discussion. But when you get right down to it, right now, Alabama has 5 top 40 SP plus wins. And that is of all the teams that are kind of in and around the bubble, that is the most. It's tied for the most with one other team who we'll get to in a second. They are in really good shape. They've got some question marks about certain aspects of their resume, but the areas where they don't have the question marks are FPI, where they're 6th in the country, strength of record, where they're 8th in the country. I mean, those two things combined with the fact that they have wins over Georgia, Vanderbilt, Missouri, Tennessee, and LSU, even though really you could make an argument that only 2 of those are really high-level wins. That's more than enough for them to get in when you look at some of the other teams that they are competing against. So I'm with you there. I think the only team I might push back slightly on in terms of the playoff lock category, and this would be highly controversial if something like this were to occur. But if BYU were to win in the Big 12, it is not inconceivable that Texas Tech could fall out of the at-large discussion. Because if you think about Texas Tech, their one win is against BYU. They have a win against Utah, which is fine, but Utah's not going to be in the playoff. And they have literally nothing else on their resume. I mean, it is not a good schedule. They
just blown everybody out except for Arizona State. Yeah. That's their own. Yeah.
I mean, and it's not like awful, but there's not a lot of other notable games on there. Again, I don't think that they would actually fall out of the playoff, but I don't know if I would yet call them a complete lock. They just are right now in a great position, and I would expect them to beat BYU anyway, which will probably make that moot. But I agree with the rest of it. I think Indiana and Ohio State, like you said, they're both 12-0. They're going to play each other. One's lost to the other. Will probably not even lock them out of bye range at this point. And then UGA and Texas Tech, I would agree with what you say there. You know, A&M's an interesting case in that they don't have a ton on their resume, but they've probably got enough with the Notre Dame win. Georgia's fine. Georgia may be underrated right now in terms of how people are perceiving them resume-wise, maybe not play-wise. And then, you know, I certainly have my qualms about Oklahoma, but I don't see any scenario where Oklahoma would get bumped out. It's probably something that should be revisited, but it's not going to get revisited at this point.
Yeah. So like, if we look at all that, like I put on here, there's one spot left between Notre Dame, BYU, Miami, and Texas. And I mentioned this as well. Like, if BYU happens to lose, then Miami's one step closer to Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And so what happens there? Do they flip them? Because then if Bama wins, right, then Bama's going to be ahead of Notre Dame. So Notre Dame then goes back to 10. And then Miami's either 11 or 12. I don't see how Notre Dame gets that argument at that point, right? Like, there's no way you can keep them at one spot apart at that point.
So let me break some of these down, because I really think it's a fascinating scenario right now that it keeps coming back to something you and I have talked about a lot. I don't understand Notre Dame's positioning right now in the poll. In the committee rankings. I mean, and this is where you can't even. I saw someone explaining it earlier online, where they were like, "Well, Notre Dame's third in FPI. They're like the poster child for FPI, and that's why they're in because the committee's using FPI quite a bit in this process, and that's probably true. They're third in FPI, but what's fascinating to me is they're, like." Miami's seventh in FPI. That Miami's ahead of Texas A&M, Ole Miss, Texas, Vanderbilt, BYU, and Oklahoma. Oklahoma's 16th in FPI and is ranked ahead of Miami, who's seventh. The thing about Notre Dame, though, that's I find wild is that if you take S&P Plus and you look at the rankings of the teams in S&P Plus, and then you look at the wins and just take top 40. I was using top 50 last week. I decided to shorten it to top 40 because I didn't want to give too many, mid-levels wins. Notre Dame's got 2 wins against the S&P Plus top 40. 2. They've got USC, who's 17th, and they've got Pitt, who's 36th.
And does that include yesterday too? I don't. Pitt, the last result. Okay.
Pitt dropped 10 spots in S&P Plus. Yeah, they were 26th last week. They're 36th now. You go through and they've got a bunch of really mid-level games that they've won. Arkansas is 52nd, Boise State's 55th, Navy's 57th, NC State's 61st. And then you get to the bad teams they've beaten. Purdue's 96th, Boston College is 103rd, Stanford's 112th, and Syracuse is 120th. That is all of the wins that Notre Dame has on the season. That's wild. And this is where one of the things about committee work that I can't stand is the completely different application of criteria. So Alabama, despite the 2 losses and despite that horrific loss to Florida State, what's kept them afloat is largely the wins that they've got. The fact they've got 5 top 40 wins. They've got the win against Georgia. But they're 6th in FPI. They're 8th in strength of record. Those things all contribute to the idea that you could take a well-rounded look at Alabama. I don't see the well-rounded aspect of the Notre Dame case. And you compare them to, say, BYU. BYU has 5 top 40 victories against S&P Plus. Now, some of those are right on the edge. I'll be the first to say that. Their wins in the S&P Plus top 40 are Utah, who's 10, Arizona at Arizona, which looks really good right now, given how Arizona
9-3,
who's 25th, Iowa State on the road, 35th, TCU 39th, and East Carolina on the road, who's 40th.
Top 40,
And again, I mean, they've got some chaff at the bottom of their resume too: Stanford, Colorado, West Virginia, and UCF. But whereas Notre Dame's got 3 teams in the sub 100s in S&P Plus, BYU's got 1 plus an FCS school. So and again, if you look at FPI, Notre Dame's 3rd, BYU's 15th. If you look at strength of record, BYU, which we heard all summer, strength of record was one of the big things that we're going to be looking at. BYU is 6th in strength of record. Notre Dame is 13th. Miami's 14th. This is where I'm just not sure, other than the nebulous eye test, what the hell is being looked at with all of this, and why certain criteria seem to be getting applied to some teams but not others, or applied lightly with some teams but not lightly with other teams. It's a head scratcher in a lot of ways.
You mentioned the committee work, right? Like if the 4 wins, the Boston College win, the Syracuse win, the Purdue win, and the other last place group of Power 5, Stanford. So they played some of the worst Power 4 teams in the country. There's no questions about that. If that was the college basketball committee, they'd be like the 300 level, the 300s, right? Yeah. You'd be like, this team, they play nobody, and we're not going to give them a spot. Yes, they've done everything they could do after losing their first 2 games. They blew everybody out. That's what they had to do. But the resume does not line up with how things have fallen for them. There's 3. I would argue Texas is probably almost more in that, better than them in this area.
I was going to bring Texas up as well. I mean, Texas only has 3 top 40 wins in S&P Plus, but they are number 8 Texas A&M, number 11 Vanderbilt, and number 13 Oklahoma on a neutral field.
Right.
Now, where I have no sympathy for Texas is Texas. For all this talk about, well, if we hadn't played Ohio State, we'd be in. You want to talk about an awful non-conference schedule outside of that. San Jose State, who's 116 in S&P plus, UTEP, who's 129, and not even the worst team they played, because that would be Sam Houston State, who was 135th, second to worst in S&P plus in the entire country. So, and of course, a loss to Florida, which everybody seems to want to just not pay attention to. Now, Texas, if you look at their overall resume, they're 13th in FPI, they're 12th in SOR, they're 15th in FPI efficiencies, they're 22nd in S&P plus. So, like, to me, those are the eliminating factors on Texas. But again, it'd be much easier if we just said we trust the computers, that what they're saying as predictives matter more, or we trust results and we say, well, if you've won X number of games against good teams, you're going to be selected over, well, we think you look good, or the computers say that you look good. Because I get both arguments, but why pick an apple from bucket A and an orange from bucket B? It doesn't make a ton of sense, like why you're not being more uniform in the way you're applying these criteria.
Right, especially when you get down past the top 6, they're so close. You really need to take these metrics more than just, there shouldn't be an eye test anyway, right? Texas looks good one week, they got blown up by Georgia the following. There's no eye test there, right? Anyway, that's a whole different conversation. But you're right. There's not a holistic approach that's helped, and you have the committee chair making jokes and just not really providing any responses to what the questions that need to be asked. Like, let's just get the committee to provide why they are ranking teams how they are. Just explain why why Notre Dame is ahead, instead of just saying, well, whatever he's spitting out, he's just spitting out garbage, right? And this isn't a Notre Dame thing. This is a holistic issue with the committee that's happened last year. It's happened this year. That just, we need to figure out a better approach to this, so it's not like this whack-a-mole of, okay, why is Notre Dame 9 and this team's 12 based on the same metrics? Like, right. It almost hurts them that they have like 7 rankings or whatever the final number is. They should almost start after week 10, because you have more data points than you put yourself in a bind. For example, with Notre Dame, because they and Notre Dame's coming off that loss. I'm sure that definitely hurt them, that they started at 18 or 19 and Notre Dame was at 10 at that point, right? So they have to build this like Curry all the way to get back up. It's like, yeah, but they've been Miami. They need to stop talking about Miami having these bad losses. They lost to SMU, who's going to be right outside the top 25, and Louisville, who just blew out.
Louisville's 30th in S&P plus now after what they did this weekend to Kentucky. And that's the thing. It's like, if you're going to compare apples to apples, fine. Compare Miami's wins to Notre Dame's wins. They have 3 top 40 S&P plus wins, and one of them is Notre Dame. And the second one is USF, who's 23rd, and the third is the same Pitt team that Notre Dame has a win against. And so, look, that it is frustrating because of the inconsistency, and it's frustrating because if you're going to if you're going to have FPI and you're going to use that, and you're going to have Notre Dame 3rd, Alabama 6th, and Miami 7th, and they're ahead of all the others in the list. Okay, why then is Oklahoma in the playoff instead of Miami?
Right?
Why Oklahoma's 16th in that. If you're going to argue that BYU shouldn't be in because of their FPI ranking, that's fine. But then, if you're going to make that argument, then Ole Miss and Oklahoma probably shouldn't be in it either, because there are teams that are well above them in FPI. And again, I've yet to hear a cogent explanation. And I have the same complaints with the basketball committee when they try to explain what they do and they can't, because it just feels it's arbitrary. And I think you made a great point, which I'll get to in a second. But the part of the issue here is that when you deal with committees and you're voting in pods, you've got all these outlier votes that have to get reconciled into a blended thing. But you could just be very clear about what the criteria are, and you would get rid of a lot of that, rather than leaving it up to the subjective perceptions of each individual committee member that's voting. That's always been my big issue with this, is that it is so subject to one or two people having such a wildly different desire in what they're voting for, that it pulls the votes in a direction that leads to an unrepresentative, result. And I think you're right. Like, there's really, if you're going to have votes, they clearly want the television show. I think you would do just as well with a show debating who was in the top 20 or 25. We don't even know who the group of 5 selections are going to be because they don't rank past 25th. And it's clear right now that there's likely going to be at least one team that is going to be in contention for an auto bid that we're not even going to see ranked because all they're doing is ranking the top 25. And for all of the debate that we've had and we've talked about it regarding the AP poll and how bad the preseason voting was in the AP poll, where 5 of the top 10 aren't even in contention right now, the fact that the committee makes the same mistakes where they make a vote, they lock themselves into the vote, and then they don't allow themselves to reassess every week. Instead, it's just like, well, we've put them here, we're going to keep them here. That, unless they lose, and then we drop them like further than we probably, Alabama probably shouldn't have dropped as far as they did when they lost to Oklahoma. But, A&M did the same thing. It is such a prisoner of the moment thing, but it also means that you're a prisoner of the first moment, because when they decided that Notre Dame was definitively ahead of Miami and definitively ahead of some of these other teams, they backed themselves into a corner. And rather than just admitting, hey, we're going to redo this from scratch every week, they seem to just dig back into that same trench every week.
You hit it on the head there. I'm 100% with you. It's a frustrating process because you're right. And even the committee chair last year said after this Tuesday, everybody's locked in. So there was no chance for movement last year with that last result or the result before. Like, things change. Like we said yesterday, or we were chatting with some friends yesterday about data points. Like, Notre Dame's last data point was Stanford, which is a really bad data point for them, where Miami's data point was Pittsburgh. That should vault Miami up because that data point didn't happen yet. So, and if you remember the very first college playoff year when TCU and I think the 2 Big 12 teams, they finished their last game of the year, but Ohio State had that last data point where they went on and beat Wisconsin 59-0. They jumped both teams. Well, they're like, why? They didn't have that last data point to say this is why that they are jumping both those teams. Yeah. So you have to see the whole thing play out. That's why when you do this show too early, and now we're getting a totally different topic, but that's okay. You're not getting all the data, right? So like Miami just being 18 at that point is not really indicative of the full picture of the 12-game season that you're actually going to see, because as we saw, Notre Dame beat a crappy Stanford team yesterday that was ranked in the 100s. Like, I'm sorry, that should not keep you at that same spot. It should potentially lower you to wherever, right, at that point.
Yeah, it's a flawed system, which is what happened. I mean, there's no perfect system on this stuff, but it is not something that is going to yield a lot of logical consistency. And look, again, whether your team is on the wrong side of the arguments we're making or the right side is less important to me. I don't particularly. I mean, I'm an Indiana guy. My team's in the field. Like, it's a bye lock. I don't give a shit who else is in the playoff at this point. But I would like to see consistently applied criteria. And I've done college basketball bracketology for decades. I am very used to the illogic and the lack of consistency that you get out of these committees. And it's just frustrating because I think for all the talk about the athletes and doing things on behalf of the athletes deserve a little bit better than some of the decisions that get made, where there doesn't seem to be much consistency in why the decisions are being made other than the brands involved. And that's a bad way to go about business if you're really caring about the competition aspects of things.
And that's what's kind of been pointed out quite a bit here on the social media angle. And like, Notre Dame doesn't have the same wins. And again, this isn't a Notre Dame thing. It's certainly turning into that. And the teams behind them, there's certainly Texas behind them now, and Miami. BYU's not the brand, and people have been pointing out a lot of BYU's metrics and statistics. Like, why aren't they even 7 or 8 or even 9? Right? They should be somewhere closer. And so it's interesting. And I'm, now that we've talked through this, I don't see a path for Texas. I'm not sure if you've gamed this out. Do you see a way Texas can somehow get in this field with BYU and Miami right ahead of them? I don't see it.
Sorry, say that. I lost you there.
I was just looking at the 4 teams that I put out there for bubble teams. If it's one spot, let's say it's Notre Dame, BYU, Miami, Texas. What's the path for Texas, or do they have one?
I don't think Texas has a path. I wouldn't put Texas in that bubble. I really wouldn't. Whatever Sark wants to say and whatever we hear complaining about this, that, I laid out their scenario earlier. They don't deserve to be in the same conversation as those other three teams, as far as I'm concerned. And again, you can talk about how, well, we shouldn't have scheduled that game against Texas, or against Ohio State. I mean, even if they'd switched that out, the people who are like, oh, they should have played like a terrible opponent. I mean, their S&P plus right now is 22.
Right.
Like playing a terrible opponent wasn't going to help that or fix that. And the fact of the matter is, when they played those bad opponents, it wasn't. I mean, they only beat UTEP by 17 points. UTEP's 129th in S&P plus. They only beat Kentucky by 3 points. They only beat Mississippi State by 7 points, and those were overtime games, both of them. You were right when we were debating this earlier. Like, what drags Texas down is not the loss to Ohio State. That was almost a free parking space for them. What drags them down is everything else, and I don't think that they have an argument, unless you want to argue that the only thing that matters should be top-line wins. But if you're going to do that, there's a few teams that you should probably kick out of the playoff, and that's where they're not going to do that. So as far as if it's down to the three beyond there, Notre Dame, BYU, and Miami, I mean, look, I think a lot of it really is going to depend on none of these teams are playing. Well, one of them is playing next week, BYU. So BYU gets a chance to pick up what would be a sixth S&P plus top 40 victory in this game.
And they're in. I mean, they're in.
And they're in automatically. If they lose the game, I would still argue that what they've done in terms of their wins is probably more impressive than what we've seen against Notre Dame in terms of the actual wins. Notre Dame has been more impressive in terms of the way that they've looked in the wins, I guess. But again, it's like, if you go to strength of record, which is supposed to measure that, BYU is 6th, Notre Dame is 13th. So this is where the eye test, like, there are supposed to be metrics that highlight how well you played against a schedule and how well you executed. And I would argue BYU, according to that metric, is the team that deserves to be in out of those three. And I would put Notre Dame in ahead of Miami, given that, because they are slightly ahead of them in that rating. So I don't know. It's close enough. Like, if you go to FPI efficiencies, the gap in FPI is not just the results on the field. It's a bunch of different factors. I think there's recruiting ratings that get factored in there a little bit too, or roster strength. If you just go straight efficiencies, which is on the field, it's Notre Dame 5th, Vanderbilt 6th, Miami 7th, BYU 8th, Alabama 10th, Texas A&M 12th, Oklahoma 13th, Texas 15th, Ole Miss 16th. Like, there's an argument to be made that BYU should be in ahead of every SEC team except for Georgia, given that particular rating. And so, again, it depends on what poison you want to pull, and this is where it is a little bit difficult. But again, I'll use S&P plus. If you go to Resume S&P plus, which, if you're not familiar with Resume S&P plus, Connolly does a good job of explaining it later on in his thing. But Resume S&P compares each team's scoring margin to what an average top 5 team would be expected to generate against a given opponent, and then they rate them accordingly. And if you go by that, again, it goes Notre Dame 7, Ole Miss 8, BYU 9, North Texas 10, Miami 11, and then you got to go to 14 for Vandy, 15 for Alabama, 16 for Oklahoma. So, like, my point is, there's enough data points in favor of BYU being in there that if you had to choose between Notre Dame, BYU, and Miami, I'm probably going BYU, at least as of right now.
We talked about some of the statistics yesterday, and BYU is really getting hosed here. That they are not. It's like there almost is this brand bias against BYU in this instance, because they have been fantastic. The Big 12, I know, is not as deep, but certainly the upper echelon of the Big 12 has been really good. And I know they got blown out in the biggest game of the year against Texas Tech And certainly that's playing a big factor. That's one game, and that's the only team they're going to lose to all year if they lose again, right? So they only have one loss against the same team. Like I said, though, now if BYU wins this game, they are the auto bid, and so that would knock Texas Tech probably somewhere in 7-10 range, somewhere I would bet, and then that puts Miami and Notre Dame right next to each other, and that's where the conversation gets really interesting. You would think of, at least in perception of everybody in the media, or if Miami is, or if Notre Dame is not behind them, there's going to be almost a riot, if you will.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. And obviously a lot of it's going to be somewhat decided by what we see this upcoming weekend, although not really, as most of these teams are not actually in action. BYU is, and maybe we'll start there as we, I know we've gone very long here. I appreciate everybody's patience, but this is a fun set of conversations. But as we head into conference championship week, we have the following teams in action, and let's start with the Big 12, which will be the noon game on Saturday. BYU and Texas Tech. Texas Tech pretty much manhandled BYU earlier on this season, the first time these teams have played. They'll be a favorite in this game as well. In fact, they're a 13.5-point favorite in this game. Now, BYU, obviously, if they win, they're in automatically. Do they have a route, in your opinion, if they lose a close game against Texas Tech, to get in as maybe the final at large?
It would seem unlikely based on, I guess we'll see Tuesday, because they were sitting at 11 last week. I don't know if this week is going to, their win against, was it West, where they played this week? They blew out.
West Virginia.
West Virginia, yeah. I don't think that is going to play too much of a role in terms of shaking things up, right? So unfortunately, if they're still at 11, they're not going to move up because Miami doesn't play. We've already both discussed that Bama's not going to get knocked out if they lose. I mean, I don't know. Actually, I said this. I don't know if you agree with that. I think you do agree. So, yeah, I think they have to win. So the at-large conversation, while they're in it, their only route is winning this game.
Yeah. So that'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on. And obviously, I think if Texas Tech wins this handily, not only does that knock BYU probably out of contention, but it also could lock up a bye for Texas Tech, which would be a great reward for them. Maybe too much of a reward, given that I'm not totally sold on their resume at this point.
I mean, and depending what happens with Georgia, that game, they could get to the 2 seed maybe.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit here in a second. Yeah. So let's go to the SEC championship game. Georgia -2.5 against Alabama in Atlanta. It's kind of it's not really a home game. Those teams are all relatively close to Atlanta. Alabama obviously won at Georgia. It was a closer game than people remember it. And Alabama has looked shaky, but so is Georgia, kind of, over the course of time. But Georgia just hasn't lost another game, whereas Alabama has. Who do you give the nod to in this one?
I keep saying until Kirby gets over this, Bama, he's 1-7 against Bama, and he's only lost 13 games against everybody else. Yeah, it's incredible. I'll give the edge to Bama. There's really no rationale here outside. Georgia has struggled against Bama no matter who the coach has been since Kirby's been there. So, and if it is Bama, that's going to have an interesting conversation. That where do they land in the rankings? But yeah, this should be a good game. I mean, assuming that they're both full board ready to go, it should be a really good game. I mean, it was tight the first time. I don't expect it to be much different the second time.
Before we get to the last couple of Power Fives, North Texas in the American Athletic Championship against Tulane. Tulane's ranked, and I got a bone to pick with that. But North Texas is the favorite in this one, a 2.5-point favorite in this game. There's a lot of things about the rankings I don't understand. The committee ranking Tulane and not ranking North Texas or James Madison makes absolutely no sense. I mean, North Texas, as I think you heard earlier on, they're 11th in resume S&P plus. They're in the top 20 in the S&P. They're, I think, top 25 or top 30 in FPI. James Madison's got a similar resume, not quite as good. Tulane's in the 50s. And Tulane, it's again, it's the lack of people paying attention. Yes, they beat Duke earlier this year. And yes, they played Ole Miss. And this is not to take away from what Tulane did earlier on this season. And, of course, they also had the the game against Northwestern at the beginning of the year where they won 23-3, but they lost by 22 points to UTSA. And they didn't really do a whole lot else that was particularly impressive. They only won by 6 versus Memphis. They won by 11 versus Florida Atlantic. They won by 7 versus Army. They won by 7 versus East Carolina. And meanwhile, North Texas has just been blowing the doors off of opponents all year. I don't understand the love for Tulane at this point from the committee. Other than it props up Ole Miss.
That's it. That's right. Yeah, I think I had North Texas ranked in our Merit poll the last 2 weeks just because you're right, they've been blowing people out. They score a lot of points. They're fun to watch. Not that that's a factor, but this should be a fun game. UNT's favored by 2.5. Both coaches are not going to be there next season, but they both will or have had a conversation with their athletic director about. They asked and said, "Yeah, you can coach the playoff." Again, different situation, but at least they didn't have this, this thing dragged out for 2 weeks. But both coaches will. Whoever wins this game will get a spot in the CFP. It will either be the 11 or the 12 seed based on what happens in the ACC.
The other game of note also on Friday and kicking an hour earlier than the American is the Sun Belt Championship. James Madison, an overwhelming favorite against Troy. And James Madison, again, has had an awesome year. You feel bad for them because there was a route there potentially to going undefeated. They were playing Louisville relatively close, and then they end up losing that game in week 2. And they've been very impressive the rest of the way. They almost blew it against Washington State, but they came back and won that game. And they have a real shot at getting an at-large. Now, they will not be able to get an at-large over the American champ because either Tulane or North Texas will get in ahead of them.
Yes.
But they do potentially have a shot to get in depending on what happens in the ACC championship game, which is happening, of course, at the end of the day on Saturday. And as you mentioned, Matt, we talked about this before. It's Duke versus Virginia, and that is not what anybody had on their dance card to start the season in the ACC. Duke is, they're not good. They keep finding ways to win. They just lost to Virginia by 17 points a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
They lost to Tulane by 7. They lost to Georgia Tech. They haven't beaten a single ranked opponent this year. They lost to UConn on the road, which is, all respect to UConn, but that's not a playoff resume. And yet here they are on opponent win percentage in the ACC. They end up getting in over Miami.
Yeah, the 5th tiebreaker or whatever it was, right? That's what it ended up being. Yeah, it's unfortunate that this came down to the ACC team or the ACC because any of the other, obviously Miami probably the best team, but if it's any of the other ones, at least you'd be like, okay, this team deserved to be in the mix. This is going to be a black eye if Duke wins this game because the ACC, there's now a real shot, and I would not that I would be surprised that Duke got one of the 2 last, automatic berths for being a champion of their conference. But if James Madison goes out there and blows out Troy, let's say it's, 50-point game, and then North Texas wins or Tulane wins, what's the rationale for Duke getting in this spot?
I can't think of one other than they are in a conference that people like to think is a power conference and is not playing like one right now.
Yeah.
There's a whole podcast that we'll do in the off season about how bad a shape the ACC is in, because I don't see the team that's going to rise up and lift the ACC out of this morass that they're in right now. I think it's great that Virginia put together a good season. They're probably going to win this game and render all of this moot. But if they don't, and Duke actually ends up winning it, it just highlights how far this conference has fallen from where it was, not that terribly long ago, where you've got Florida State, you've got Virginia Tech, you've got teams, popping up and doing good things nationally. It's like it's all gone at this point.
Well, and right, if Duke wins, and let's say they don't get in, Miami might not, they're going to have 0 teams in the playoff, which, if you want to have conference suicide, that's it right there. No teams in the playoffs is a real problem.
Yeah. Well, and especially, especially when you consider the way all of this has gone in terms of political maneuvering and financial maneuvering. As much as you want to criticize the Big 12 at least had a plan of what to do when they lost Texas and Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And you wonder what the sliding doors moment was like with, if Clemson's season hadn't gone off the rails, maybe we're not even having this discussion. They just feast on everybody and have an easy path all the way. But that's not what occurred. And they had such a bad season, relatively speaking, that you wonder, well, will they be able to pull it back together again over the course of the next year? Yeah, I mean, the ACC could really be in a position where not only do they not get a bid, but they are staring down the barrel of a very difficult couple of years here as they try to figure out what exactly the identity of their conference is. At least the Big 12 seems to have an identity.
That's a great point. I think, we'll certainly touch on this in the offseason. And we'll take a hard dive in the ACC because the best win of the year for a long time was Florida State winning that game against Bama. And that seems like such a long time ago, but wow. They lost also Florida yesterday, right? It's like, it's unbelievable how it's all played out for the ACC this year. And it's certainly, there could be one more really bad turn. And I hope Virginia wins, because that would just be obviously a great story for them to get to the playoff under this what's happened this year for that team.
Absolutely. Final game, obviously, the big one in the Big Ten, number 1 versus number 2, Indiana versus Ohio State. This is somewhere between a 5.5 and a 6.5 point spread in favor of Ohio State, according to Vegas.
Yeah.
Now, you got to remember how point spreads work. Point spreads are not necessarily a measure of relative strength. They're a measure of how well can we get the public to bet on both sides. FPI actually has Indiana as a minuscule favorite in this game, and S&P Plus, Connolly's projection as Ohio State is a 1 point favorite in this game. So the power metrics and the computers really think these teams are close, and that's what we've seen essentially for the entire second half of the season. Both of them are right next to each other in SOR. Both of them are right next to each other in terms of game control. It's strength on strength, and both of these teams, on the one hand, the implications for this game from a playoff perspective in terms of seeding and an appearance, they're basically non-existent, because they're both going to get in. They're both going to get buys unless something catastrophic happens in the game, which seems unlikely. But I do think it's a fascinating matchup, because for Indiana, it's a chance to really announce, hey, we've absolutely arrived, and we should be considered the favorite going into the playoff. For Ohio State, I mean, they are probably the most talented team of any team in the country right now, and they are, I think, not particularly excited about the fact that, A, they're still not getting the respect on the national stage that SEC teams of similar caliber would get, and that, B, the number 2 team in the country, who's very similar in metrics, is in their conference and playing them in this game. So there's just a lot of interesting little factors here. I don't know how both teams are going to approach this game. I think it's going to be a really fascinating one, though, if they both decide to go out and give it like 100%, and they probably will at this point.
We talked about this last night, you and I, when we were watching some of the games. Ohio State has won the conference in 5 years, and Indiana has never won it in this century, this century, and haven't won it since 1967, right? Or whatever year it was, 68. So there's reasons for both of these teams to come out and play. Yes, it's the first 1 versus 2 in a championship game since 2009, the Florida-Bama game. So it's great. I mean, it's great that, and it seems like it's being minimized for really no reason. I mean, the ticket price suggests that it's not being minimized here within the Midwest area. I think it's going to be a really fun game. I'm curious to see how far Indiana's come in the last 14 games, 15 games as they played Ohio State up there at Ohio Stadium, where Ohio State was just physically better in that game, and you just knew they were better. I don't know if that's the case at this point. I think these two teams are very equal. Defensively, I think it's going to be a rock fight. Maybe I'm wrong. But I'm really curious how this plays out, how both teams go about it. Ryan Day's already said, he's like, we both probably have buys, but it's an important game for both teams. We've won the Big Ten in 5 years. So I'm excited to watch this. I think it's a really fun matchup for both teams. I think it's going to be the most interesting not the most interesting matchup, but the highest ticket, as Indiana's going to flood the ticket market, as they already have. As I know you're trying to go and you're having those conversations to see if you can get up there for the game. But this will be really fun to see how far Indiana comes in. If Indiana does win, being the number 1 team going into the college football play would be something certainly that I don't think you ever thought would happen in your lifetime.
No, absolutely not. I mean, and look, the thing is, and I will go into a lot more depth on Crimson Cast,
Yeah, absolutely.
the IU football show, where we talk about this matchup throughout the course of the week. I don't want to bore any non-IU or non-Ohio State fans too much on this, but I will say you could pick a handful of statistics for either of these teams, and you'd find that the other was very close by. On paper, it will be a very close game. In terms of action, look, Indiana's got to prove at the end of the day that they belong on the same field as Ohio State. And while I actually think they played better in that game last year than they are often given credit for, and we can talk about that later on this week on the other podcast, the reality is Ohio State won that game handily and won the national championship last year. They were clearly the better team. Indiana's got a hell of an opportunity here to really announce themselves. And the great thing for both of these teams is they can kind of go balls to the wall because they're going to have 3 weeks off between this game and the next time they play, because they're both essentially guaranteed a bye, again, unless something catastrophic happens, which hopefully it will not. I mean, mostly injury there, but it's not a foregone conclusion Ohio State's going to be this much superior on a neutral field versus Indiana as they were in Ohio Stadium. And I do think that kind of thing matters. I'm fascinated to see what the crowd composition looks like in Lucas Oil Stadium. I think the assumption from a lot of Ohio State fans is that they're going to walk in and take over the joint like they have historically at Memorial Stadium. I'm not so sure. Indiana has traveled really well, and the fans are pretty loud. I mean, it'll be a really interesting scenario, and I am very curious. And I think the thing I'm most curious about, though, Matt, is this the last time we see these two teams play each other this year?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And I think we both agree that they'll be on opposite sides of the bracket. I don't see them being the 1 and the 4.
Yeah, that was kind of the last thing I wanted to get to on this. Go ahead.
There's depending how this game plays out. Like if it's a close game, there's a really good chance we see these two teams again. And as Galen was probably about to say, is I would assume, and this is just an assumption, that the loser's not going to be the 4 seed. They'll be the 2 or the 3 seed based on how things shake out. They're not going to put these two teams on the same side of the bracket to meet in the semifinals. They would likely probably put these teams on the opposite side so they meet again in the final if they were to both make it there for sure. I just can't see them dropping one of these teams 2 spots with an unblemished record where in Alabama, if they win, they're going to have this 2 losses. They're going to drop 6 teams to get up to that bye. That's making an assumption that Bama goes up that high. I have no idea what happens if Bama even wins, right? I mean, the loser could still say 1-2 depending on how things shake out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things that lend themselves to the idea that these two teams are going to get byes regardless of what occurs, and a lot of it has to do with how far superior they are in FPI to everybody else. I mean, Notre Dame isn't playing anymore, and their FPI is 25.0. They're tied with Oregon, and Texas Tech's at 22. Alabama's at 21.5. I give you all of this because Ohio State's at 28.5 and Indiana's at 28.4. It is very unlikely both of those teams or one of those teams drops far enough that you could legitimately justify moving somebody above from a power ranking perspective. And as you said, right now you've got a group of teams at the top of the rankings that is, they are in curious positions in terms of what could they possibly do over the course of the next couple of weeks. We know Texas A&M is going to drop out of the top 4 with the loss that they had. And if it follows along with what happened to Alabama, they're probably not going to drop as far as Alabama did because it was their first loss. But I could see A&M dropping to 6th, maybe 7th. I'm not sure how they're going to treat some of that. And then you look at Georgia, who's got 11-1. They'll almost certainly be 3rd in the poll. Then the question is Texas Tech 4th? Is Oregon 4th? Oregon's 4th in the AP poll, which was a real surprise to me this week. I don't know that the committee's necessarily going to follow, but they did follow the AP poll pretty closely this last time around. So
it was really close, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the most likely scenario would be the winner of this game of Ohio State, Indiana gets the number 1 spot and the Rose Bowl. Number 2 probably goes to Georgia, so long as Georgia beats Alabama. If Georgia doesn't beat Alabama and it's Texas Tech beating BYU and BYU isn't in the field, I do wonder, do they just do they keep Ohio State or whoever,
Yeah.
Indiana or Ohio State, whoever wins, at 1 and 2, and then they slot the teams in below them? That is an interesting question, because I do agree with you. The idea that they're going to try to keep Ohio State and Indiana apart in any seeding capacity until they might meet again in the championship game seems to make a lot of sense, given that we're going into the playoff essentially with them 1 and 2 overall.
Right. And so, like, and even if you look behind Georgia or Texas Tech, Oregon, it was beaten by Indiana, so they're not moving below them. And then the only other one-loss team, not that this is the only factor, is Ole Miss, and they're done. Oklahoma's done, Notre Dame's done. Bama would be the only other team. It would be curious to see how far Bama moves up if they were to win this game.
Well,
would they get into the bye scenario? I don't know.
I actually do think that what would likely happen in the scenario that Alabama wins would be you would probably end up with Big Ten winner 1, Big Ten loser 2, Texas Tech 3, as long as Texas Tech beats BYU, and then Alabama 4.
Yeah.
And then Oregon probably 5 and Georgia 6, and then Ole Miss 7. I think that's how that would go.
Yeah, I think you're right, because Georgia's only losses would be to Bama. Bama would have both those wins, so they'd have to jump. Yeah, I think that's good. That tracks, right? So that would be, and then I guess what you said, Georgia 6, Oregon 5, probably interchangeable at that point.
What that would allow you to do is you'd have Alabama, Oregon matching up if Oregon wins the 5-12.
So splitting them up.
You'd have Texas Tech against Georgia, and then you'd probably have Indiana, Ole Miss, and Ohio State versus Oklahoma if the rest of the rankings held the way that they were going to.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily going to keep everybody away. There's only certain things you can do. But I will note that last year, if you look at what they ended up doing in terms of the bracketing, suspiciously, they managed to figure out a ranking where they kept most of the teams away from each other. And
that was that weird ranking for the top 4 and that was the top 4 champions. Thank goodness that didn't exist this year. Can you imagine? With like Duke and everything else. Oh my, jeez.
But it's like you ended up last year where, yes, you did get Oregon, Ohio State as a rematch in the first game, but that was entirely a product of having to seed Boise State and Arizona State. You didn't end up with Arizona State, Texas was a quarterfinal. That was not a rematch. Georgia, Notre Dame, that was not a rematch. And Boise State, Penn State obviously was not a rematch either.
Yeah.
I do think that if they can avoid it, they'd like to avoid having conference on conference crime happening before the semifinals, if at all possible. So we'll see if they actually do that, but I think it's something to keep in mind.
It's something, and you kind of mentioned this too. If Georgia does win, you're going to have a cluster of teams with Texas A&M, Ole Miss, Oklahoma, and Bama. I don't know if all of them would potentially make it. Probably at least 3 of them would, if not all 4. They're going to have to play each other in the first round. That would probably be the scenario where there's going to be something, because they're all going to be seeded 5 through 10. Right. So there's probably be one game there that's going to be SEC versus SEC, but they may not have played this year.
Yeah, exactly. Well, going to be a lot of fascinating things to keep an eye on. And we didn't even get into the coaching hires that happened today. We need to do another show this week, clearly, where we talk about all that. So look for that in the feed later on this week. We'll obviously have updates on the committee rankings when they come out, because this is really maybe arguably the most important one. And I'm fascinated to see what they end up doing with some of these teams, and whether they do take some new information or whether they keep it the way that it is. But we'll have all that coming up this week, and then obviously we'll be back with reactions, maybe live and maybe in person on Sunday of next week, as we will know less than a week from today who's going to be playing whom and when.
Yeah.
Hard to believe it's gotten here this quickly, but a lot to look forward to, and looking forward to chatting with you about it as we move forward with it, Matt.
I'm excited too. Will we have a Penn State coach soon too? We don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. So weirdly, they have not hired someone. I'm suspicious. Anyway, for Matt Blaszka, I'm Galen Clavio. This is Football Weather. Thank you for entertaining us an extra amount of time. This time around, we went an hour and 40 talking about college football. We could have gone another hour 40 probably and not run out of things to talk about. But we'll catch you folks on the flip side. Thanks for watching Football Weather. Check out the rest of the Back Home Network shows. Catch you folks on the flip side. So long.